Nyeba gunle namdol sing yende gunge gemba bo semje gunge nyen jigu tamje kenla gun cha Omen jege gemba dan dusum sange gunge ngoni rasim chego musmaden zebe Seve lame shavla so wade Dambichu Nyamslembi kulung sambo Nijungi sambadang Jajugi sim Detabichu Tosam Nyamlinchaki Kokaprapati Kalba Sangbuin Sambi Kato Dang Tembe Koni Dambichu Nyamslembar Shu
The excellent intention to practice the sublime Dharma. It consists of the mind of renunciation as well as bodhicitta. And now that we have received an amazing opportunity to study and contemplate this profound Dharma, give rise to the attitude which recognizes how fortunate one is that this has happened, and with that motivation, please listen to the Dharma.
Tini Nanganzo Lam Kingo Damitobi Sherap Seti Kandis Nyamlin Chekugre Esani Tishubikabre That Damiti Tavi Kapsu Ribe Tenla Pamni Tini Gombe Kapsula Gomkugure.
Currently, we're discussing the path, as well as the essential aspect of the path. That essential aspect is the wisdom that recognizes the absence of a self. And we can ask, well, how is it that we go about practicing this path, which is essentially this recognition? So that's what we're talking about. This is the discussion that we're having here right now. And when we talk about the absence of the self, or selflessness, from the perspective of ascertaining the view, we do that via reasonings, through logic, through rationality. And we come to a decisive understanding or certainty about that. Then when it comes to meditation, what we do is we familiarize ourselves with what we have ascertained.
Damiti Kobe Nyamsu Lentangi Kor Chidang Ume Shungdang Labrim Chachin Zochen La Sopa Susu Kamni Damla Mindawa Mambo Yore Da Chidang Gwakabiyena Ani Tinsu La Tosu Lojon Chani Susu Ki Lolam Bapatang Wangbo Kamdan Tumba di Karitu Sini Di Nyamsu La Shawayna Chikjina Dosiyang Pendo Chevadago Yung Sigre.
When we are meditating, familiarizing ourselves with what we're talking about here, this selflessness, there are many ways of going about doing that. And what I mean by that is that there are many, we can call them pith instructions, or very pithy ways of advising students to go about practicing and learning about selflessness. For example, we have the Madhyamaka teachings as well as the Great Perfection teachings, Mahamudra teachings. Within just those kinds of perspectives, we have so many different kinds of pith instructions, pithy advice that we can take. And if we have the opportunity, we should really take the chance to study it, to study each of them. But more importantly, those instructions which really harmonize with us, which really feel like they're in tune with us, that they're appropriate for us. So if we take the opportunity to engage in study and with all these different kinds of practices, things, especially ones that really harmonize with us, it's extremely beneficial. And so I advise that.
Pena ngansu ta me pasini tenla phaptang de komtang di shisa dawa yin ya ta ti ngansu yin technique se ba approach dawa di yang ti dis minda ba yong si yong ge re pena umai pi kapsula dak me ba se tu zo di ta dinde kin da di tope ta samle ma to dembar matu pa se so dinde ki kane mala ta che ta ni gomyong go re ta dini yang su ne chu che be ki kap ta we yin ba yin ne dini tong ba ni ta ta me se ni gomyong de zo wo di ni jin ta dang gi de den jin cha so den jin di zo wo shu shu ma sam ta en kapsula dini sungjin se ki je shung go ba sungwa me pa tang ani dinde yin ba yin du jimba ran shin ma tu pa dinde yin ba yin du ani thatu sungjin ni su me bi ki cha de den la pa mi dini dame dan ton yin kom da dini sung re da din zo den la da shira ke ba yo ma re yin ya gom yong de kapsula ta den la fa tan ti su min da ba yo ti ya mi kha she la dembar ma tu ba re islam na lo lamba ba tang gom de ba yong sigre se kham dang wang bu me ba la tuni yang kha she la da sungjin ni su ma tu ba re je sa ani da me ba re sne sam tang ba ina yang gom de ba de yong si ba re.
For example, when we are coming to understand what we mean by selflessness, when we're coming to a decisive point of what that is, there are many techniques of going about this. We call them approaches. There's so many different ways to go about actually coming to this certainty. For example, within the Madhyamaka tradition, when we talk about selflessness, we talk about it in the sense that the self is purely a conceptual label. It's all it is an imputation. Therefore, it's not actually true. It's not a solid, inherent reality. It has no foundation in that respect. And so it's through analyzing and figuring out why that is that we then come to familiarize ourselves with that, or we call that meditation. So that's one way. Another way, for example, is through the Yogacara path. We talk about, with the Yogacharans, they talk about emptiness. It's the same thing as selflessness. And the way they approach it is through talking about the idea of duality. What is duality? Duality with respect to something that is clung to and that which clings to that. A duality with respect to object and subject. And it's through that path that we come to recognize that there is no object to be clung to, therefore that means there is no one that clings. So through that process, one recognizes what the Yogacaryans mean by non-duality, being free from that which is clung to, and that which clings. So there's all different kinds of ways of going about this approach to selflessness. And for example, again, some people find that if you tell them, okay, there's the self is not truly established, and that kind of resonates with them, and they really find that to be helpful. And depending on their personality and their constitution, we could say. And others find the idea that, or find the approach that the self is completely free of duality, or we can say that the self doesn't exist from the perspective of there being freedom from duality, that which is clung to and that which clings.
대가나시 우마 테란이라 스무땅바이네야 우마랑 유베게드니 다음에 텔라 파병도 쩨베크타 림기 아니 텔라 파 곰네 데리치기요래 드니 우만 태규바이나 지차도 까니 곰용거라 봐 다된소 랩사 찍바레데 네야 곰용도 있더니 간사기 다 왕보랍 튕기 개발했더니 탑시 민다바 예바인데 스스 왕보다 튜바디 카두갸바이나 곰바이나 펜도치아 용스기로 와 네 디제선 쉬고요.
If we look specifically into the Madhyamaka tradition, we have these two kinds of approaches to the same goal. The first being the Svatantrikans, or the Svatantrikans? Yeah. So we have this Svatantrika versus the Prasangikas. The Svatantrikas, how is their approach unique? What they do is they go through each of the different ways of, we could say, clinging, the different ways of exaggerating the truth, and they eliminate each one as not being a possibility for the way that things exist. Going through each one, they eliminate all the possibilities, and they come to the recognition that is free, the nature which is free from all conceptuality, free from all extremes. And then the next one, the other approach is that of the Prasangikas, we can call the consequentialists. What they do is they completely eliminate all the possibilities at once. All conceptuality, all extremes are eliminated in a single instant, and it's through that approach that they meet with the meditation of freedom from conceptuality. And so essentially what's happening is they're getting to the same place. It's just a different approach. And the approach is in accord with the individual doing the meditation, doing the analysis. There's individuals that are maybe more apt than others, others that need a bit more guidance. But essentially it comes down to what works for them. And so it's through approaching this selflessness with the approach that works best for you that brings about the greatest benefit.
다 림기바다 지체로 와서 이러한 아주 gradual 다 simultaneous 이렇게 개발하고도 와.
Another way we can talk about the difference between the Prasangikas and the Svatantrikas is that the Svatantrikas are considered gradualists, while the Prasangikas are suddenists or subditists. So it's through this either gradual or immediate approach that they differ.
다지단 계란 왕보 라비나 지체로 빌람데 펜도체 요래 숨바래. 엔 계란 왕보 딩나 타마다고 있나 림기 빌람로 띵고 와.
And it's explained that for those of the highest faculties, their approach is best. The way they approach the truth should be through this immediate or this sudden, simultaneous approach. And for those that are of middling and lesser faculties, it's best that they go through the gradualist approach.
라서 다딩에 가지 쉬이스나 아주 단다 가수 바바데다 우메기 댄식 라테니 엔 다메 땐라 파단다 지당 더버레 디르와 차상기 투몽 더버레 이네양다 디 고명도 카시게 디니 스스라 마펜바다와 소나 연구 여바이나 아니 곰당 탑시 셴바야 먹고 요레스 와 디경바 말레스 디디 스스기 디 도즈지다 롭천자니 아니 냠는 제바이나야 디기 마펜바이니 셴바기야 소소라 펜세그와 디딩 하나솔라 옵션 먹고 요레스 디케기 주둥이 슈고요.
Right now we're talking about the approach of the Madhyamikans and the use of reasonings to analyze and to come to meditate on selflessness. And we're doing this because this is very common. This is what's most common. This works the most in general sense. However, if we don't find that to be helpful, it's not to say that there's no other options. We have plenty of other options to choose from. And it's through our personal study and our personal practice that we should apply ourselves to things which we find to be the most beneficial, that really resonate with our own practice and our own study.
다 로종게 냠는다고 제베 값을 이나니 되니 군줍 값을라 다진 세디 꾸마다고 지체 땡아라주 땡셰 땡주 마미다고 지 그러봐 다 마미 디기 가뒤는 꾸마 연구도 두미도 따지 따는 레바다 낙상 숨니 되니 콜라지 팀당 그러봐 어 덴데시니다 로종도 좀 망문나라 다진 세디 아라주 다임바다 되니 코가 연구도 베베 삽삽지니 따대고야지 덴데기 돈이 냠는 제였은 거야 가시 돈이 냠는 제반에 변도 좀 먹어서 그러봐 다 되니 don당이 냠는 제베 값을라니 되니 덴데기 다도 좀바 세디야 되니 밀람당 주마다 그래 했으니 되니 고민 거래 도디나 로정 값을라 다진 세디지 파 로기 미다고 줄었어 니 미디지 미 소소긴 다다고 소소를 내가 얘기한다고 시 다띵 아주 가디네 삽삽지니 삽삽지기로 봐 소소를 내가 얘기긴 미지 소소 질러요 봐이나 아ten데 망부송해라다 아니 덴바단 시신이디 덴데긴 다냠도 파 탑승제가 락자다고 지라 배샤
We can think about this, the approach to selflessness from the point of view of lojong, or from mind training. And what I mean by that is that, say, from the lojong perspective, on a relative level, we think, we personify, we could say, this ego clinging as a kind of thief or an enemy or someone that can harm us. And mindfulness and alertness, we personify them as, we could say, like soldiers, or we could say policemen, someone that protects. And what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to regard ego clinging as the enemy. And we should be very careful about what that enemy is doing. If they're getting close, if they're getting too close, then we have to, we can seize them, capture them, throw them in prison, punish them, what have you. And that is done through the policing, say, of mindfulness and alertness. So so we're always concerned, okay, what's happening with my ego clinging? What's it doing? How is it harming me? And you're thinking about how to benefit your practice by eliminating it, or getting rid, say, of that ego clinging. So this is from a relative perspective, right? We're kind of personifying these things, ego clinging and mindfulness, and working it with that through a more relative kind of means. Ultimately, we can think of clinging to the self or ego clinging as purely just like a dream or an illusion, right? So we kind of go to a more ultimate perspective. And again, so these are the ways that we can talk about the approach of meditating on selflessness through a kind of mind training approach.
Tadi into anzu kasan shubi ki riba tinzo yang kashi ki tadi zu pe konyo ko tabu stu di into tab debu ji dami kom ko du samna lojong ki kom dan de zu tab debu yore sidi kar resna ta dangbo dajin se di yabu ji mindu di ngone nyokta jire sha ngala dungan te jire sha sambi di ngazu ha ko shira kale mi do wa ha ko kore di ha ko wache di gaujang ne pa se ro wa ta deni katui ina pe semba di temba da shishin ge sap chini kodang ngai ni ro wa ani chamgi mes ko ngala ngomayan de ba mo ba ke so mong ba ne tarun de ba mo ba ke ngi ba de ko nga zawa ni ni tar ba tang me ani ni tabshi ganda cheni ganda ko kapte jagi ko wang도 nga dogme samba ro sta tende ge ji nga zu ina confident ro ji to ne ani katui ine ya ji sana ya tu na ya nyane keje sheba ine ya ko 연구도 연구미도 ro ba ani ko yongma 타도 되니 densheki 파 다디 랩송 야고민도 선파 참샤네 봐 된데 제바에는 야 대수야 제검랑래 제검 제디스 레라 버도 와 되니 다 할람 띵상 아주 지배는 내암도 지용도 가와도나야 되니 내암디 고그레 삼니 직심 독선 중도 와 칼라 카레가 라과라 세니타이저 쭉 다미레 제 중도 와 셈라 denshi shungu dwa oda denshi shing dazin la ya tini ko nang la du song wai na ro ba ta nyaw da su ye san pe ji alertness da denshi di tempo che bai na ta de yang tini da me chokum che ba se da ji ba cha ru go re lo jong gi ko ni
I'm talking about this other approach because we've been talking about these reasonings, these logical rationale, going and that way to approach selflessness, and it can be quite confusing. It can be a little difficult to wrap our heads around. So I thought maybe an easier way of explaining it briefly is through talking about it through the aspect of mind training. For example, ego clinging, where it's very easy for us to understand that it's no good. It's very problematic. It's harmed us so much in the past. And it's just essentially not helpful. That's very easy for us to wrap our heads around, right? So that's what we mean by when we talk about ascertaining the certainty of what we need to get rid of, what we need to abandon, what we need to reject, what we need to refute. From that approach, it's quite easy to understand what we mean. On the other hand, mindfulness and alertness, it's very easy for us to understand that ourselves and this ego clinging, we're not good friends. We're not good for each other, right? This ego clinging is always harming me, causing me so much suffering. Not just that, it's stopping me from attaining liberation. It's the very thing that is keeping me from attaining Buddhahood or awakening. And it's easiest for us to think, okay, I got to do something about that. What can I do in order for myself not to be controlled by this ego clinging, right? And we kind of have this confidence that, okay, I'm not going to put up with it anymore, right? I'm going to do what I can, whatever methods and practices are available for me to rid myself of this ego clinging. And so we're always thinking, okay, whatever I'm doing, whether I'm eating, going, sleeping, talking with people, is this ego clinging, is this flaring up? essentially? Is it strong? And what can I do? We always have this mindfulness or alertness associated with making sure you're distanced, or on guard against this ego clinging. And so what we call this is this analytical meditation, right? We can easily talk about it from this perspective. To give an example, which we're all pretty familiar with nowadays, is we have this epidemic or a pandemic, this infectious disease that everyone is so concerned about, right? And rightfully so, because what we're doing, we're thinking about it so much, so we take precautions to protect ourselves from it, right? We use hand sanitizer, we wear masks, etc., right? We're doing things to guard ourselves from the dangers of being infected. So at the same time, this kind of way of thinking about it is the same way we should think about ego clinging. We need to use mindfulness, use alertness in order to guard ourselves, to protect ourselves from this ego clinging. And so this is from the perspective of mind training that I think is not just helpful, but is a more easy way to understand what we're talking about.
Penantangasu dagzin seti tadi varista wajila imbaina tangaransu ki demba dang shishin dang paye setin zoki tangansu master sanitizer da wata tizuredo.
So we can think of clinging to the self, ego clinging, is like this virus. And with our mindfulness and with our alertness and with our carefulness, what do we do regarding this virus? We wear masks, we use hand sanitizers, we take all these precautions.
Dani lojong ki kesunang la damga jore lelen tamje jigla da sa tadi sigdi mayun dir고 가고 둔다 들어가르스나 아주 또 삼바당도 요라 먹고 줘라 봐. 요라 차상 게 중사게 싸워다고 지금 전에 맨 스위치도 줘라 봐. 디디디니 찍라도 슬라바래. 디 하거나 아니 걔랑 요라 차상도 배워 차로. 디 하마거나 걔랑 기지 스위치 셴바든 소다 맨 스위치 거랑 업 맞지는 셴바든 소 제반에 양자수 바르는 거로 봐. 디 스비 가르스 세거르스나 닥진들 세거르. 닥진디 뭐시니 계란기 년보 텐트 바이나다 계란기 아주 가르쳐 버려가지 강의기 소스 쪼버셔 봐 어디 학원에 가고서로 시리스티는 렐렌 탐지 찍었다 쓰는 시요.
Within the mind training Lojong tradition, there's a short slogan or pith instruction that is used, and it essentially means look to the source of all your problems. And so, for example, what is it that causes all of our troubles? What is it that causes all of us our suffering? There's a main switch. For if that switch is turned on, we have these troubles. If it's switched off, then there's no troubles. It's essentially that there's one source for all of our suffering, of all of our problems. If you know what that is, then you can use the antidote and switch that off. If you don't know what that is, and if you don't know where the switch is or what it is or anything about it, then there's no way to switch it off. And there will be a continual cycle of suffering. So, and again, if you don't switch it off, it's going to come back. The light essentially will come back on. So what is it that we have to know? We have to know what we mean by ego clinging. If we know what ego clinging is, we recognize it, we can apply the antidote. We apply the antidote and rely on the antidote. And what happens is all the source of all our troubles are switched off. by having this recognition and applying the antidote.
So atene nganzu khachang mola cheba chigdure ki riba sadi ani telatene dame komdani shubi kawa tadi dini khachang nganzu neshi changwa asini dini gacha ngeba kyapa ngeba chidal ngeba dudal ngeba asini tadi zo khachang shubare
Previously, we discussed the reasoning which analyzes or investigates the essence, which is the reasoning which is the freedom from the self being one or many, one or different, singular or different, we can say. It's this reasoning that we approach the recognition of egolessness or selflessness. And within that context, we have these four certainties that we need to familiarize ourselves with. The first being the certainty which recognizes what it is that needs to be refuted. The second one is the certainty which recognizes the limits of possibility, or the logical framework for how we go about refuting the self. The certainty which recognizes freedom from being singular, and the certainty which recognizes the freedom from being multiple or different. In our previous discussions, we've gone through the first three.
Chidanda nge tingwa mabu shu san yang yaji tenshu da uzu du shu bai na dakzin se di le ngoye ne zu la le par tak sha ba yin ba kan shi la ani ngaran zu jinbin jindang de gi tu yong de le par takpa 잠시 마인 bar 율 랑은니 아니 주 dum닌데 요바 지 운니 임바 통규 요바 숨규 요바 그러봐 지 독도 찾고 더버지 요바 다 텐데게 지 전화 준 거가 봐 딜라더니 텐데게 짐비 짐바 이체 삼로들라 가르세 그러선 나가선 스미스 이거
We've talked about this quite a bit before, but it's worth repeating. And that is, what do we mean by ego clinging? We can kind of define it by this: the mind imputes something to be real, to be instantiated in reality, and what do we? This is the self, a self which is we impute as being truly existent, and it's the mind which misperceives. It's a confused mind, which thinks that it's actually real, solid, inherently established thing that exists out there, that is that seems solid and believable and trustworthy. It's essentially this mind which not only imputes, but then imputes as something that is completely real and solid reality, and that thing is us, the self, the identity.
딩이 가사에 뭔가 쉬는 주디 인식이 측벽이 당도 셀프세도 이내 연다 또 다들 가르세 그래서는 나세 아이세도 어디랑 세거래 네 양고할 노규요 말이 심바지 세고에 그지 말에 아이세도 어디가랑 미세도 어디를 세거래
From a technical perspective, we when we talk about in Tibetan this idea of dak, yeah, we call it the self. But what I really want to get across is it's not that impersonal. It's I. It's what we think of when we say I, me. That's what we mean by the self. It's important for us to recognize what we mean by the self. It's this I, this me, we cling to.
Intellectual and philosophically self says go to me this segeo maratagio samotagio martin argument.
And to just keep it as something that's very kind of an intellectual or philosophical kind of term or terminology isn't helpful so much. We need to really actually understand what we mean in this context by the self.
That is to be considered penam the kerang mingla penang azu miji nge mingla ki sita chi karma se lagyo na miji ki ndo sune karma se lavinde lamsa chi ngane se chole sto odinga awso chole grwa ta di tro shukchero tanguduna miji ngala karma kuma dawsi labai na lamsa ji kerang de shukchero dugudo wa ngonda mindawaji digi volume dawati odilang tenich la nga sigor tenich towa sowas towa odila sigor di ko ge chumbodwa.
And how can we explain this? For example, your name, right? Say your name is Karma. You identify with that name, right? And if someone shouts at, "Hey, Karma," you immediately have this sense of, "Oh, me? You're talking about me?" You have this sense, right? This feeling of identity that comes with being called out. So that's one level. But when you can, maybe we can turn up the volume essentially when if someone says, "Hey, Karma's a thief," he's a thief. What are you're gonna be more the sense of self gets stronger, the volume turns up, you have more aversion to that. You can really feel what we mean by the self when we add things like, "Oh, you're a thief," something like that.
Karma se di ngai bache ta dela tozu mokabutin yabulamna gakin chita ta dela tozu chitubulamna lungla ken ta tindish to dilatini ngabitanda paspa nga se dilasigo.
So we have this base where we can kind of represent by just the name that we identify with. Say your name's Karma, you identify as Karma. But then on top of that you have these terms like, "Oh, he's kind of a happy-go-lucky person, he's a nice guy." Or you have these things, "Oh, he's a mean guy, he's really rude." So as on top of this we have this more kind of identification that becomes stronger, and this comes down to this sense of self.
Tadi pena ngi khasan pedi thara duzen gi peda larwa tada ngi labana shi denla thakpa yimba kan shi la gyugin duma shi zombala teni ani garre thakpa din durre du sambiki teni dela teni jignang ke barwa oda dazin se de ngi dangi shubana shi denla dul se di yugi tendu me bala loeki sweshakpa ganshigla ani duzin dig zin yongdu yurangwen du pa zini chikwa ke ba na shin jeni ani dak se chegya denla le takwa tsamshigle yugi den me ba ganshigla chulne zin yongdu tini digi nyoda mangbo chi soyung go re sumo dunga ki go re sumo re da pedan pejen jawai na.
I gave the example of the snake and the rope, right? In actuality, there's no snake there. It's just a rope. But through causes and conditions, the confused state of mind can arise to think that the rope is a snake, right? And it's through that confusion, that imputation onto the rope of the snake, through causes and conditions, that we give rise to this confused thought, this misapprehension, this misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding itself gives rise to fear. right? We have a fear of the snake. So in actuality, there's no snake, but it's through it's mind made this imputation that there is actually a snake out there. And we think that it's real. It's actually the case that there is a snake. So there's no question about it. And then we come to we apply that to what we mean in this context, this ego clinging. In actuality, there's no self, but the mind imputes a self to be there, and despite it not actually existing, this confused misapprehension, this misunderstanding, clings to it as being actually truly real and there. And it's through that clinging, that misunderstanding, that all of our troubles, problems, and sufferings arise.
다 pena thara duzingi tulba yongela gyume kemele chungwa mare tele gyu yore ken yore te yang gyu khone chungwa mare la ken khone chungwa mare gyu ken mangbo zombal tene chungwa re pena tangbo mi dila dulkin jikpa ke thube ki nuba chiyo ko dwa baksha chiyo ko re di mena thara dul tu thuye yomarba chik dire and 내가 난신기 율디한테니 둘 다버지 요거도와 다 내가 난신기 되니 지 록데 세브 맵에 쏟아보다 난 내가 난신기 코랑기 지 또지 갈라 그래 뭐만 둘기 쏟잡는 그 트라마 여바다보다 다 된저 차상 좀 용도 되니 루진 셰바기 차긴 차상 좀 용거 그래 좀 용도 루진 셰바디 게용 그래 했라 그래와 빼대 신도 나랑 좀 다진데야 규메 게메라 때는 중화 말에 데라 gyu yore, ken yore, mangbosh yore. Tadi nga zu nangba sanje peke nga zu tende yang la chunyi dinsu dishe gyabyon de dine gyu dang, nyumongba dang, le dang, dungan la soba mangboch dishe gyagarwa. Ta du jise du gyu gen de du yoba dese du nga ranzo la dagzin di yungare es la bare. Dine du namshi kerang pena tada duzin sheba kiye gi gyudinzu 차상지 매바이나 데 두진 셰바 끼기 말아 내가 하는 시간 안 졸라더니 다진 기 출바디 중얼 제발라 gyugendu 차상 아니 매바 차상마이나 다진데 용거야 말해 송말해
In the example of the snake and the rope, it's not that this confusion comes about without any causes or conditions. In fact, there has to be many causes and conditions that come together for this confused mind to arise. Meaning it's not just one thing that causes it. It's not just one condition that leads to that. It's a collection. It's a group effort for this mind to arise. For example, firstly, we have the person that is confused that there's actually a snake there. First has to have the propensity, or the tendency, or the pattern that knows firstly what a snake is, and to then at the same time have a certain fear or aversion toward a snake. If that propensity, if that tendency is absent, they're not going to have this confused state of mind. The causes wouldn't be there for us to imply or to impute a snake to be actually out there. Secondly, the form itself, in this case it's a rope. The rope has to kind of look like a snake. It can't look like something completely different. There has to be some kind of basis, a similarity of form that we can impute onto it, and therefore give rise to this confused mind. It's also aided by the fact that maybe there's low light. One can't see very well. You might even have trauma in the past that you've been bitten. So you have this propensity to watch out, to have a fear, to be careful when it comes to things that look like snakes. And then thirdly, there's the mind that is necessary, right? And with all that together, then the confused perception the misunderstanding of a snake can arise. In the same way, clinging to a self, ego clinging, it doesn't just happen without reason. There are many reasons or causes and conditions that have to come together in order for it to rise. Within the Buddhist tradition, we talk about the 12 links of interdependence. Things like ignorance, karma, the afflictions. These are all causes and conditions. Causes and conditions for what? For this misapprehension, this misunderstanding of clinging to a self to arise. So we can say, for as long as there are conditions and causes present for these confused minds to arise, they're going to arise. As long as we have the causes and conditions for clinging to the self, they're going to stay there. Same thing, if we have all the causes and conditions necessary for us to believe that a rope is a snake, we're going to see the rope as a snake. So what I'm saying here again is, if these causes and conditions are eliminated, if they just aren't present anymore, it's impossible for the confused perception of clinging to a self to arise.
데 임바송산타 상계 점된 데기 나나서 데기 프로세스 차상디 캔니 에는 알아서라 덴데기 직발을 되베 탑 형수 줘봐지 숭샤래 딜란 남기 아주 덴바시 있어요 와 다등이 아주 다다 듀선을 빼샤바이나 둘 루툴니 직발게 바디 둥행이 덴바세들 고대워지나로 와 다더니 덴데기 직바 깨고에 긴규기 단경아주 쉬임바 덴소들라 군중된바 세요래 다더니 미디기 둘 레두 마레도 스니 따제 땅용도요와 따제 땅에게 탈람제요와 답변나가라서 단기 통사게 사제들라 또 아니 규과지 개원이 타바들 구즈구즈제 아니 갈레갈레 때바인 아다 고네다니디 노르샤 스니지 타바이 망어토용 거봐 타마타마들라 딜라 람기 템바 세거래 다더니 탑셰 딜라 때니 타바 임방어 토마타도 가rel라도 그랬으나 둘리짐심바디 파 예도르고 로게라와 다딘데 인데니 둘디 각비 차들라 고비 템바 출바디 균체베 차들라 고비 템바 숭바레 다디 아니 가나도 다진라잖아요 지거와 다진라티네 동아 좀바디 동아 템바 다진 코란디 군중 템바 다 다진 계획이 규긴데서 되네 다메도 베셰랍데 람기 템바 다메도 베셰랍라 때는 다진데 방 각도베 차들라 고비 템바 스는데 도스모진 지초거래
The Buddha recognized the process of what's happening here, and knowing what the process was and what was happening, he was able to teach the method to rid ourselves of this suffering. And the method that he taught to do this, to get rid of ego clinging, to get rid of the suffering that comes with it, is the four truths, or the four truths of the noble ones. If we first, I'll go through the example, right? We can use the snake and the rope example to really illustrate what these four truths are doing. The first being the truth of suffering. It's because of this confused misapprehension of clinging to the snake that we have all this fear and this suffering. So it's true that this is happening, right? The truth of suffering. The second is the truth of origination. There are causes and conditions that lead to it. Recognizing what those are is what we mean by recognizing or the truth of, or the noble truth of origination. We recognize what those causes and conditions are for that mind to arise. The next truth is the truth of the path. In this case, we can say it's the means of investigating, of analyzing the methods or the path that bring one to really come face to face with what we're talking about and recognizing whether it's true or not. For example, in the case of the snake, we might we know where we're looking at, right? It's somewhere in the middle of the road, maybe, or in a dark place, and we get the courage to get something like a stick and to go out and actually, poke it and see if it's actually a real snake or not. And we're doing something, right? This is the method that we're engaging in order to see whether or not this is true. This is the path. This is the path that we have to traverse. And when we do that, we recognize, oh, this state, this is just purely a misapprehension, my mistake. This is not actually real. And what the next step is the truth of cessation, right? Once we go through that process of investigating, that the means, that path of investigating, our clinging to a snake being real is eliminated, and therefore the continuity of that confused mind and the subsequent suffering is eliminated. That stream is cut, and we can apply that the same thing with the ego clinging. It's true. The truth of suffering is that we have this ego clinging, and it causes us so much suffering. The truth of origination is that there are causes and conditions that lead to that misapprehension, that misunderstanding. The path is that which brings us to engage with and investigate whether it's true or not, and it gives us the process that we need in order to eliminate it. And then the actual elimination of the confused mind is what we call the path of cessation, or the truth of cessation.
Tini da khasang anzu da chigdal tuba se de kapsula da phungbo dang an dak se di phungbo dang chigi na ngoye ni su dang thungu du thungu min du rawa tinde ta che tang ni tini da jing ki jindang de da phungbo ki ngoye ni su di thungu me ba yin tini phungboda chik ki chuldu matu patela ani chik dhantarwa sinda dus komu gorwa deyan tini da subudan sem ni shani subure doge sem re doge susem ni ki chokpa dere doge srwa di reki yena ani deni ki ngowo de da ki ngowo den zu digi du digi mindu sinidini rebi ki chendur cheni dordu na ani subudan sem sopa kare shakwa inaya ngoye nisudan tungime ba hindu dadu zimba sayadi tubare shaa sayashi rwa adi ngoye simba tila kare chikdan dalba nge ba sumba rwa doskom gugo rwa.
The reasoning of the absence or the freedom from one and many, we approach this by questioning whether or not the self is identical or completely different from the five aggregates. For example, the first reasoning, if it is it true or not that the self is identical with the five aggregates? Does it contradict the way that I apprehend or perceive the aggregates in relation to how I cling or apprehend the self? Are these two ways of clinging, or these two ways of apprehending, are they in harmony with each other, or do they contradict each other? Right? We have to see if it would ever be possible for us to actually truly cling to the self as being identical with the body or the five aggregates, and we recognize that it can't be. We can further investigate by thinking or asking ourselves: is it true that the self is identical with the physical form? Or is it true that the self is identical with the mental mind? Or is it somehow a combination of these two? And we ask, is it okay for this, what we essentially believe to be the self, is the essence of what we think the self is it identical to any of these three possibilities. And we investigate, and we come to the recognition that it can't be like that. It just doesn't work. There are too many contradictions, and they don't mesh with each other. Therefore, we come to gain certainty that the clinging to the self as being identical to the five aggregates is impossible and doesn't work.
다 대갑수 개충부터 가르랬으나 빼나 단지 빼들라 둘당 타과디 찌그레 슬라바이나 봐. 디니 둘기 케체디 연대에서 타바 강라 요고거라 타베 연대에서 둘 강라 요고거라 봐. 디니 연구요 말에 내가 제디 다제 땅용도 다 출두다 지도 출두거라 봐. 이네 제바지 용도. 다 니바디 가르레스나 르기 진당기 다데당 율기 내당 예부디 퉁구도 퉁문디 따고 걸어봐. 르기 진당데당 율기 내당 얘기도 퉁구도 퉁문디 따고 어디 계신 거라 했어. 세디 르기 진당데기 둘 진케나 율기 내당데 둘제도 말을 뒤따고 걸어봐. 다디 덴바 이메 따war지 봐라. 르기 진당데기 둘도 진게나 아니 율기 내당 거랑 둘제도 말해도 신디 따고 걸어봐. 다 율기 진당데 출발 이메라. 봐. 디마도 조사요 말봐. 다 르기 진당기 둘 짐만나신 율기 내당데 둘차 되게나 거덴바래. 다진데 덴바봐. 다 르 진당디 둘기 출도 진샤바에네 율기 내당디 둘기 ngol 마투바에나 다티니 거 출발 이마치 라초 용도 봐. 다 내가 때 디레다. 도디나 다진 세디 다 람상 담에 마도나야 또 엄용도 당원이 다진 세디다 출발해서 삼비 갈라간 삼치 당 아주 삼복하고 니 코르토 바이나 가르더니 다 할람 제금 제비게다 가서 그래 리브다워시래 당매 즉 원숨도 똥 맡음나야 다진 세디디 덴바 말에도 취샤 삼비 삼로지 코토도 와 내가 주요 그거
What's important to grasp here is, again, let's talk about it from the perspective of the snake and the rope. Is it possible for the snake and the rope to be identical? If it's so, what does that mean? What do we mean by that? The snake has its own qualities, characteristics, and the rope has its own qualities, its own nature. If they had to be the exact same thing, they would have to share those qualities between each other. And is that possible? Right? With the confusion is that they are the same, but when we investigate, is it possible that a snake can be a rope and a rope can be a snake? Can they share their qualities mutually? So what are we saying here? It's between two things. It's the way the mind clings. It's how the mind clings to something as being something, versus the reality of the object itself. If those two things are in harmony, then we can say something is true. If the way that we cling to something, if the thing exists in the way that we cling to it, then it's true. If it does not exist in the way that we cling to it, then our clinging and the way the thing exists contradict each other, right? So when we cling to the snake or the rope as a snake, the way we're clinging to it is being a snake. But the actual reality in front of us is that it's just purely a rope. So those two things cannot coexist. And so we see, okay, within the rope, there's no essential snake. And we can say, okay, it doesn't exist. Simply that. The same thing comes with perceiving the ego or the self. We recognize that it's not possible for the way that we cling to the self and the way that the five aggregates exist in reality for those two things to be identical. Therefore, this clinging to a self is a confusion, right? So this is what we mean by analytical meditation. When we're convinced that it can't be the case that the five aggregates are identical with the self due to this contradiction in the way that we think and the way things are, or the way that the basis exists. That's the result. That's the result of our analytical meditation. And it comes down to essentially the way that we directly perceive the things that are happening, directly perceiving, say, the five aggregates. Is it possible for this clinging to a self to be in harmony with that? And so if it is, then it's true. If it's not, then it's a confused state of mind.
다 디양 돈다 친윤윤 증가는 쉬바에는 내가 더도 가르스나 둘 여발라 때니 둘진 셰바께 봐 말해 둘진 셰베게 둘 파르딱샤 내가 들다 와 만주 다 둘진 셰바 코랑 와라 가리 딩겨 그랬으나 둘 여바 송사 녜 통바래 했으니 둘 임바다 여바 송사 아니 녜 셰바께 봐 딩겨 와 코랑게 되니 딩겨 그래 뇌니 술라 가르래 둘진 셰바 코랑기 툴니 둘 파스에 샤바라 마도 둘 여발라 때니 둘진 셰바께 봐 말해 내 인디 닭 나나서 툴 용도 가리 통교열에서는 닭 여발라 때니 아니 닭도 짐바 인스니 삼로 코인 거 봐. 이는 왜 니술 가리 계란게 닭도 짐발라 때니 닭도 중화를 마도 닭 여발라 때니 닭도 짐바 수 중화 말에 스타디 내가 디레. 대한 식 뉴스에나 가리 now 당아주 나왔어 그러와 셈라 때니 율출바디 파 중샤바를 마도 율출발라 때니 셈디 추 중샤바 말레스 나와당 셈세 그러와 셈라 때니 나와디 중샤바를 마도 나와라 때니 셈 중샤바 말레스 내가 디 하거나
Okay.
다 도도라고 들
So we've come to a very important point that I like to really emphasize and get across. It is not because a snake exists that we cling to it, that we're confused that it exists. Let me say that again. It's not because the snake actually exists that this confused mind that thinks that it exists arises. It's due to the confused perception that we impute that there is a snake out there. It's not because a snake actually exists. It's purely based on this confused state of mind that we then subsequently impute or project the appearance of a snake. And why do we cling to a snake being there? Because we think it's actually there, right? It's not. We're not pretending. We think that it's truly there. We're perceiving it as being actually present, when in fact, in reality, there is no snake, and all it is that we're perceiving is the result of a confused mind, a confused perception, the imputation of a confused perception. Same thing with the self. It's not because the self is actually present that we cling to it, that this confused perception arises. We truly think that it's there. Because we truly think that it exists as an actual object to be clung to, that you should believe in, that you should trust in. It's not that way. It's actually it's a confused perception that subsequently imputes out there that the self actually exists. So we can say it's based on the ego clinging that we project a self. It's not because a self exists that we then subsequently cling to it. So we can make it in a few words, we can say it's based on the mind that we project. We have perceptions. It's based on the mind that appearances arise, not the other way around. It's not due to the appearances that the mind that clings to it arises.
Pena ngala chasha na ni dosta yondu kari tongo yoresena bebe ki shingi chokzen yin jebuchi tongo yorwa ni kari dingo yoresena pake di shingi chokzen yin jebuchi yinba song zang se ni tongba res di dingo yor wa nangwa ki yul tene nge di sem di jungba res dingo yor ngoy nisu la kari resena nga mi yinba tang nga beba yinba chik songza nga la mi yinba cha tang bebe kin basha yoba yindu deki basha ki nuba minba la tenne ani di chokze ning jeboji tong song war ma do page chokze yinba la tenne nga tong ma mare pena keranzu inji jegi ta di peje ning jebo tong go yu mare dega na shingi dialogy semje shenbaji yoba ina chazang dire tong go marwa.
For example, take me. When I look down in front of me, what do I see? I would say that I see a very nicely decorated, very beautiful Tibetan style table. Right? I think, okay, out there is a table, and so the process of how it works is that I believe that there exists a table out there, and the perception, I see the table. And why would I say, why would you say that you see the table? Because it exists out there, right? My perception, I say that I see the table, I see this beautifully decorated Tibetan table, because it's really out there, right? You can see how these two things are related to each other. When I say I'm a human, I'm a Tibetan, I have the tendencies, the patterns, the psychology of a Tibetan person. And it's through the ripening of that psychology, the ripening of that pattern, those tendencies, that when I look out, I see a table that I find to be pleasant. Why? Because it's decorated in the Tibetan sense, right? My perception, the appearance of a of what I call a beautifully decorated table, a Tibetan table, in fact, exists out there, and I see it because it exists out there. Alternatively, maybe Westerners don't find this table to be as beautiful or as nice as I perceive it to be. And certainly for other kinds of beings or other kinds of sentient beings might not have that perception either, right? So it's based on this mind that I have that I perceive the table to be a pleasant thing.
Nganzu namju table yimba songza nge table thongware dingyorwa yul dingona legdwa ini ya ngoi nisula karresna nga mi yimba songza di table thongware ma to table yimba songza nga thongwa mares.
Okay, young person.
Nganzu namju kare dingyorresna yul khorang di table yimba songza nge table thongware de yul dingona legdwa gyumsen de ngol legdwa ngoi nisule karresna nga mi yimba songza nge di table thongware ma to phage di yul yimba songza nga la table thongwa mare. That's just sig the cover to check.
The way that I see the table, I think that a table exists out there. Really, there's a table out there, and it's because there's a table out there that I see it, that I apprehend it. But actually, the opposite is the actual case. It's because of me being a human, me being what I am, the mind that I have, that it's based on that I actually see a table or I perceive a table. For example, a cat doesn't see this as a table.
Kisi table yimbe gyumsengi table ngala nawaina shimike table thongogare nge table thongori thongomidwa. Shimila table thongege basa mebare jeza ma thongbare ngala yebare jeza tindi kare yul mare yulchin res.
So it all comes down to it's not an objective reality. It's a subjective reality. It's because I'm a human and have these tendencies that I see a table, versus a cat doesn't have the tendency or the psychology to apprehend what a table is. Therefore, if they see it, they don't have the same kind of perception I do of thinking it's a table. So it's not the object which is the responsible for the perception. It's actually the subject which we can call is responsible for the perception.
Dakti dazingi par sue shabara mato dagla teni dazin chu ke shabamares da ngego tiri.
It's because it's due to the ego clinging that we impute a self to exist. It is not alternatively that because a self exists that we then have this clinging.
Tadi indu ngoye ki nesul dang taji thara dusingi sheba nashi ngoye ki nesul de dang ngara zu jindangi de tada goshu lo de re.
When we say, we go back to this the example of a snake and a rope. In reality, there's the way that things are, and there's the way that we cling to things as being real. And when in the case of the snake and the rope, we can see very clearly that these two are contradicting each other. They are not in line or in harmony with each other.
그래서 다들이 인도르디나 아주 다음에 고미용도 있더니 곰다 민다와요래 아니 소소라 가래 참바이나 디콤나야 변도치 뭐 용식이래 서와 되지 경고도스 니바디 되니 다음에 다진세디 르근로다 임바 인두 되니 율세기 셈기 파셔 쇠샤바라 마도 세기드니 셈세디 율라티니 추중샤바 마레스네 하고야 되다 하나도 시작이드니 곰갸베 가서겠다 나와 셈세셔와 이게 전부 차대결
So in brief, today we first talked about that when it comes to meditating and familiarizing ourselves with egolessness, selflessness, there are many ways of, many approaches that we can take. And what we find that benefits us most, what fits with us most, is going to be the most helpful. So that I encourage one to find what fits with you and then meditate or use that approach, and that would be very beneficial for you. Secondly, we talked about how when it comes to clinging to the self, it is the imputation of a mind. It's purely a mental imputation. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's not due to the object itself that we have this misunderstanding. It's actually due to the subject, the mind. It's from the mind. It's the responsibility of the mind. It's through the mind that we have these misapprehensions. It's not because it actually exists there, but it's through the subjective perspective that we cling to appearances as being true. So the pithy line would be, appearances are mind.
janju semjo rinpoche mage banam ge gyurenje ge ba nyambara me ba ya gone gondo belvare sho